"Don't eat the center of that steak." The words weren't spoken. They were written in neat blue ink on a folded white note that appeared beneath Ethan Caldwell's dinner knife just as he reached for his first bite. His hand stopped in midair. Around him, crystal glasses chimed softly beneath the glow of handcrafted chandeliers. Conversations floated through the private dining room in measured confidence, and the scent of oak-fired prime beef mingled with rosemary butter and expensive red wine. Nothing else had changed, yet somehow everything had. Ethan slowly unfolded the tiny note, expecting a joke from one of his executives or perhaps a message from the maitre d'. Instead, he found only one more sentence beneath the first. "Please trust me." He stared at the handwriting for several silent seconds before lifting his eyes across the room. Standing nearly 30 feet away beside another table was a young black waitress in a perfectly pressed black uniform. Her name tag read Naomi Brooks. She wasn't looking for attention. She wasn't waving her arms or trying to interrupt dinner. She simply met his eyes for the briefest moment, gave the smallest nod imaginable, then quietly resumed pouring sparkling water for another guest as though nothing unusual had happened. Ethan frowned. For 15 years, he had built Caldwell Biotech into one of America's fastest-growing pharmaceutical companies by ignoring distractions and trusting evidence instead of emotions. His board often joked that he could spot weakness in a business proposal faster than most people could read the executive summary. Investors admired him because he never hesitated. Competitors feared him because he rarely made mistakes. And yet, for reasons he couldn't explain, he found himself lowering the steak knife onto the porcelain plate instead of cutting into the perfectly cooked fillet resting before him. Across the 12-seat table, one of his senior partners smiled. "Everything all right, Ethan?" He glanced down at the folded note before quietly sliding it beneath his napkin. "Just thinking," he answered. No one questioned him. They had learned long ago that when Ethan Caldwell became quiet, something important usually followed. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Chicago skyline shimmered above the river like scattered diamonds beneath the summer night. Inside Blackstone House, one of the city's most exclusive private restaurants, every detail reflected precision. Every waiter moved with flawless timing. Every plate arrived within seconds of schedule. Every guest had been personally approved weeks in advance. Tonight's dinner wasn't simply another luxury meal. In less than an hour, Ethan was expected to finalize a multi-billion-dollar partnership that financial news outlets had already begun calling the business agreement of the year. The signatures waiting inside the leather portfolio beside his chair could reshape an entire industry before sunrise. Yet none of those documents occupied his thoughts anymore. Instead, his attention remained fixed on a waitress no executive at the table had noticed before tonight. Because somehow, without raising her voice, without interrupting a single conversation, and without asking anyone to believe her, Naomi Brooks had managed to make the most powerful man in the room afraid of taking a single bite. No one at the table noticed the waitress again after that brief exchange, and that was exactly how Naomi Brooks preferred it. She moved quietly through the dining room with practiced precision, refilling water glasses before anyone asked, replacing silverware with steady hands, and disappearing from conversations before her presence could become part of them. To the guests gathered inside Blackstone House, she was simply another member of the service staff, another face that blended into polished marble floors, warm amber lighting, and the rhythm of a restaurant where perfection was expected rather than celebrated. Ethan Caldwell, however, could no longer look at the evening the same way. His instincts had always rewarded observation, and now every small detail demanded his attention. He glanced toward the open kitchen where chefs worked with disciplined efficiency behind spotless glass walls. He studied the expressions of the servers carrying trays through the dining room. No one appeared nervous. No one seemed alarmed. The restaurant continued operating with flawless confidence, making the folded note feel even more impossible to explain. Across the table, his chief financial officer leaned closer with a relaxed smile. "The investors are ready whenever you are," he said. "They have been talking about this partnership for months." Ethan nodded without taking his eyes off the untouched plate. "They can wait another minute." That answer surprised everyone. Ethan was famous for respecting schedules down to the minute. Delays irritated him. Hesitation was something he associated with poor leadership. Yet tonight he willingly interrupted his own timeline because a stranger had quietly challenged his certainty. Several seats away, one of the international investors laughed while describing the remarkable quality of the restaurant's signature steaks. Glasses were raised. Compliments drifted toward the executive chef. Someone joked that the meal alone justified flying across the country. Ethan forced a polite smile, but his thoughts remained fixed on the handwriting hidden beneath his napkin. It was not emotional. It was not dramatic. It contained no explanation, no accusation, and no attempt to impress him. Just a simple request followed by complete silence. That restraint unsettled him more than panic ever could. Meanwhile, Naomi continued serving nearby tables with the same calm professionalism she had shown since the beginning of her shift. She never glanced toward Ethan again. She did not linger near his chair hoping for recognition. She did not whisper to another employee or signal toward the kitchen. Her composure suggested that whatever had motivated the note had already been placed in his hands, and the next decision belonged entirely to him. Ethan respected that more than he cared to admit. He had spent years surrounded by people eager to influence his choices, each offering louder opinions than the last. Naomi had done the opposite. She had trusted a few carefully chosen words to carry their own weight. As he looked once more toward the open kitchen, something almost invisible caught his attention. One of the head chefs paused for barely a second while inspecting another freshly prepared steak beneath the bright preparation lights. It was a tiny movement, gone almost immediately, but for a man whose career had been built on recognizing patterns, it felt like the first loose thread in a tapestry that had seemed perfect only moments before. The faint pause Ethan had noticed inside the kitchen refused to leave his mind. Most people would have dismissed it as nothing more than an exhausted chef checking another order, but his success had never come from noticing the obvious. It came from recognizing the details everyone else overlooked. He watched as another perfectly plated steak disappeared through the swinging doors toward a different table. Every server moved with rehearsed confidence. Every plate looked identical beneath the warm dining room lights. Every guest remained completely unaware that the most important decision of the evening was no longer waiting inside the leather portfolio beside Ethan's chair. It rested on the untouched meal before him. Across the room, Naomi Brooks accepted another tray from the kitchen with the same quiet composure she had shown all evening. She thanked the line cook with a gentle smile before carrying the plates toward a family celebrating an anniversary. She laughed softly when the young daughter proudly announced she was ordering her first filet. The parents smiled. Naomi wished them a wonderful evening and stepped away without drawing attention to herself. Watching her interact with other guests only deepened Ethan's curiosity. There was no trace of fear in her expression, no sign that she regretted slipping him the handwritten note. She simply continued doing her job with the calm confidence of someone who had already accepted whatever outcome might follow. Ethan had spent years reading people during billion-dollar negotiations. He knew what nervousness looked like. He knew the subtle movements of someone hiding information. Naomi displayed neither. Instead, she carried herself with an unusual certainty that reminded him less of a waitress and more of someone trained to trust careful observation over emotion. His attention shifted toward the executive chef greeting several distinguished guests near the open kitchen. The man accepted compliments with polished professionalism while discussing premium beef suppliers, precise cooking temperatures, and rigorous quality standards. Every answer sounded flawless. Every explanation inspired confidence. Yet Ethan noticed something else. Each time another steak left the kitchen, the chef instinctively glanced toward the past before returning to his conversation. It was only a fraction of a second, almost impossible to catch, but it happened every single time. Patterns mattered. Habits mattered. Small inconsistencies often revealed larger truths. Ethan folded the handwritten note once again and slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket instead of throwing it away. For reasons he still could not fully explain, the simple piece of paper had become more valuable than the contract waiting beside him. One of the investors raised a glass and proposed another toast to the future partnership. Crystal chimed throughout the private dining room as everyone reached for their wine. Ethan politely lifted his glass, but left the untouched steak exactly where it was. Several guests exchanged curious glances, assuming he simply was not hungry. None of them realized that the quiet decision of one unnoticed waitress had already changed the direction of the entire evening. And somewhere beyond the polished dining room, hidden behind spotless stainless steel counters and immaculate presentation, the answer Naomi wanted him to discover was still waiting to reveal itself. As the conversation around the table shifted toward market forecasts and expansion strategies, Ethan Caldwell quietly excused himself with the calm confidence of someone simply stretching his legs between courses. No one questioned him. His executives assumed he was preparing for the final contract discussion. The investors continued exchanging stories beneath the warm glow of the chandeliers while a pianist in the corner eased into another familiar jazz standard. Ethan walked slowly through the dining room, not toward the exit, but toward the open kitchen that had captured his attention minutes earlier. From a respectful distance, he watched the organized choreography unfold. Every cook moved with remarkable discipline. Steaks rested beneath heat lamps for carefully measured moments before being plated with roasted vegetables and delicate herbs. Sauces were brushed with artistic precision. Thermometers appeared only briefly before disappearing into apron pockets. Everything reflected excellence. Yet Naomi's note continued echoing inside his mind with stubborn clarity. Please do not eat the center. It was too specific to be random, too restrained to be theatrical. As he stood there observing, he noticed Naomi collecting fresh dinner plates from the service station. She did not seem surprised to find him nearby. Instead, she greeted him with the same quiet professionalism she had shown every guest throughout the evening. Is everything satisfactory, sir? She asked politely. Ethan studied her expression. You already know why I am here. Naomi remained silent for a moment before answering softly. I hoped you would decide to look instead of simply trusting my words. There was no fear in her voice. No attempt to persuade him further. Only patience. Ethan lowered his voice. What exactly did you see? Naomi glanced briefly toward the kitchen before returning her attention to him. Not enough to make an accusation. Enough to ask you not to take the risk. That answer only deepened the mystery. She was not claiming certainty. She was demonstrating restraint. The quality impressed Ethan more than confidence ever could. At that moment, another server carried a freshly prepared steak toward the dining room. Naomi's eyes followed the plate for only a fraction of a second before settling on the garnish resting beside the meat. Her expression changed almost imperceptibly. She stepped closer to Ethan and spoke quietly enough that no one else could hear. Look at the rosemary. Ethan frowned. The garnish appeared perfectly ordinary from where he stood. Naomi continued in the same calm tone. Not the leaves. The moisture underneath them. Ethan narrowed his eyes. Under the bright preparation lights, he finally noticed something unusual. A faint, almost invisible sheen had collected beneath the herbs on only one section of the plate. It was so subtle that nearly everyone would have ignored it completely. Naomi did not. She watched details the way experienced scientists watched laboratory results, never rushing toward conclusions and never ignoring evidence simply because it was inconvenient. Ethan realized she had not written that note because she wanted attention. She had written it because she had seen a pattern that did not belong inside a kitchen celebrated for flawless consistency. And somewhere behind that nearly invisible detail was a truth still waiting to emerge, one that neither the executive chef nor the distinguished guests had recognized, but one that Naomi Brooks had quietly refused to overlook. For the first time that evening, Ethan stopped relying on instinct alone. He stepped closer to the service counter and quietly asked whether he could speak with the executive chef before the next course was served. The request was polite, but it carried the unmistakable authority of a man accustomed to having difficult questions answered. Within moments, Executive Chef Daniel Mercer approached with the confident smile of someone whose reputation had been built over decades of flawless service. Is there anything I can improve this evening, Mr. Caldwell? He asked warmly. Ethan did not point toward Naomi. He did not mention the handwritten note. Instead, he looked directly at the steak that had not yet left the kitchen. Would you mind walking me through your preparation process? Daniel appeared slightly surprised, but welcomed the opportunity. He explained the sourcing of the premium beef from a respected ranch in Nebraska, the dry aging process, the precise internal temperatures, and the finishing butter infused with garlic and rosemary. Every answer reflected expertise. Every movement reflected pride. Ethan listened carefully without interrupting. When the explanation ended, he asked one final question. May I see the steak before it goes out? The chef nodded without hesitation and gently lifted the finished plate beneath the bright preparation lights. Ethan leaned forward. At first glance, everything appeared exactly as expected. Then he remembered Naomi's words. Look at the rosemary, not the leaves, the moisture underneath them. He shifted his angle slightly until the light struck the plate differently. There it was again, a faint glossy ring collecting beneath only one side of the garnish, while the opposite side remained perfectly dry. Daniel noticed Ethan studying the plate and smiled politely. Presentation matters here. We inspect every dish before it leaves the kitchen. Ethan quietly replied, I believe you do. Then, after a brief pause, he added, would you mind slicing this one open? The chef hesitated for the first time all evening, not out of concern, but simple curiosity. Taking a clean knife, he carefully cut through the center of the fillet. Several cooks naturally glanced over before returning to their stations. Nothing dramatic happened. No one gasped. Yet Daniel's expression slowly changed. His confident smile faded into thoughtful silence as he leaned closer to inspect the interior beneath the bright lights. He reached for a thermometer, then stopped halfway. Instead, he gently pressed one section with the tip of the knife before examining the juices collecting on the cutting board. Ethan watched without speaking. Across the room, Naomi continued serving guests as though this conversation had nothing to do with her. She never looked toward the kitchen. She never waited for recognition. She simply carried another tray through the dining room with the same quiet professionalism that had defined her entire evening. After several long seconds, Daniel looked up at Ethan with a seriousness that had not existed moments earlier. Excuse me, he said softly before turning toward one of his senior cooks. Please bring me the remaining fillets from this batch. His voice remained calm, but the atmosphere inside the kitchen changed almost instantly. Conversations became quieter. Movements became more deliberate. One by one, additional steaks were placed beneath the preparation lights. Ethan realized the evening had just crossed an invisible line. This was no longer about one untouched dinner. It had become a careful search for an answer that only one person in the building had noticed before anyone else, and she had chosen to reveal it with nothing more than a few handwritten words on a folded piece of paper. The additional steaks arrived one after another until 6 nearly identical plates rested beneath the bright preparation lights. To every guest sitting beyond the glass partition, nothing appeared unusual. The soft piano continued filling the dining room. Wine was poured with effortless precision. Conversations about stock prices, venture capital, and global expansion flowed without interruption. Behind the kitchen counter, however, the atmosphere had quietly transformed. Executive Chef Daniel Mercer inspected each fillet with growing concentration. He sliced into the center of every steak, comparing texture, moisture, and color with the careful discipline of someone who no longer trusted appearances alone. Ethan Caldwell stood beside him without speaking. Years in business had taught him that truth often arrived only after silence had done its work. Daniel reached for another clean knife and separated the rosemary garnish from one of the plates. Beneath the herbs, the same faint glossy sheen appeared again. This time he looked more closely, touched the surface with the edge of a clean-tasting spoon, and paused. His brow tightened. He motioned for the sous chef to bring the finishing butter used during plating. Within seconds, a small stainless steel container was placed beside him. Daniel opened it, examined the texture, then compared it with another freshly prepared batch stored in a refrigerated drawer. The difference was subtle but unmistakable. One mixture had begun separating because it had remained under warming lamps longer than intended. The butter itself was still safe, but the separation caused uneven heat retention on several steaks, leaving portions of the center below the restaurant's own premium serving standard. For most guests, the difference would have gone unnoticed. For a restaurant that built its reputation on flawless consistency, it represented a serious quality failure. Daniel closed his eyes for a brief moment before letting out a slow breath. She noticed it from across the room. He murmured almost to himself. Ethan remained calm, without touching the plate. Daniel nodded in quiet disbelief. Without cutting it open, without tasting it. She saw the moisture pattern beneath the rosemary and realized the finishing butter had cooled unevenly. That only happens when a batch sits too long before service. He looked toward the dining room, where Naomi continued assisting another table, smiling politely as she recommended a dessert to an elderly couple celebrating their anniversary. She had never interrupted the kitchen. She had never embarrassed anyone. She had protected both the guest and the restaurant with nothing more than a handwritten note. Daniel immediately instructed his team to discard every steak prepared from that batch and begin again using fresh butter and new timing. The cooks responded without complaint, moving with renewed focus. No voices were raised. No blame was assigned. Excellence demanded correction, not excuses. Ethan watched the entire process with quiet admiration. In boardrooms, people often fought to prove they were the smartest person in the room. Naomi had done the opposite. She had protected strangers, respected the chef's dignity, and trusted that careful observation would speak louder than public recognition. As the first replacement steaks emerged from the kitchen, Daniel turned toward Ethan with genuine humility. "I owe your waitress more than a thank you," he said softly. Ethan glanced across the dining room toward Naomi Brooks, who was already carrying another tray, as though this evening were no different from any other shift. For the second time that night, he realized the most valuable expertise inside Blackstone House had never been wearing a white chef's jacket or sitting at a billionaire's table. It had been quietly moving through the room in a simple black apron, asking for nothing except the chance to do the right thing. Daniel Mercer waited until the replacement dinners had safely reached every table before he quietly removed his chef's jacket and walked into the dining room. His steps were calm, but those who knew him understood the gesture carried unusual meaning. Executive chefs rarely left the kitchen during peak service unless something truly important demanded their attention. Naomi Brooks had just finished clearing dessert plates from a nearby table when Daniel approached her with a respectful smile. "Would you spare a few minutes after your shift?" he asked. Naomi looked almost embarrassed by the request. "Of course, chef." Ethan Caldwell, standing only a few feet away, spoke before Daniel could continue. "Actually, I would appreciate hearing something now, if you are comfortable sharing it." Naomi hesitated for a brief moment. She glanced around the dining room to make certain every guest had been served before setting her tray neatly onto the service station. "I only noticed something familiar," she said quietly. Daniel shook his head. "No, you recognize something that every professional in my kitchen missed." Naomi lowered her eyes, clearly uncomfortable with praise. "Years ago, my grandmother owned a small neighborhood restaurant outside Kansas City. It was never famous. It only had 12 tables. But she believed consistency mattered more than reputation." Ethan listened without interrupting. Naomi continued in the same calm voice. "When I was 14, she taught me that rosemary absorbs moisture differently depending on how heat moves across butter. Most people look at the meat. She taught me to watch everything around it instead." Daniel smiled with genuine admiration. "That is not something they teach in culinary school." Naomi returned the smile. "No, she taught me because we could not afford to waste a single steak. If one plate was not right, we fixed it before a customer ever noticed." Ethan studied her with growing curiosity. "You learned all of that in a family restaurant?" Naomi nodded. "Later I studied food science for 2 years at the University of Missouri. I loved it. I wanted to work in quality assurance for restaurant suppliers one day." She paused before adding the next sentence almost as an afterthought. "My grandmother became ill during my second year. Tuition became impossible. I left school and started working full-time. Life changed. The lessons did not." The words hung gently in the air. There was no bitterness in her voice, no attempt to gain sympathy. She simply stated the facts the way someone might describe tomorrow's weather. Ethan realized that was what had impressed him from the beginning. Naomi never used knowledge to make others feel small. She used it to protect people from mistakes they could not yet see. Daniel folded his arms thoughtfully. "You could have called attention to the problem in front of everyone." Naomi looked toward the busy dining room where guests continued laughing, celebrating, and enjoying their evening without ever realizing how close the restaurant had come to falling short of its own standards. "My grandmother always said that protecting someone's dignity is just as important as protecting their dinner," she answered softly. "If there is a quiet way to solve a problem, start there." Ethan felt those words settle more deeply than any business advice he had received in years. Billion-dollar negotiations had taught him how to build companies. Standing in the middle of an elegant dining room, listening to a quiet waitress honor her grandmother's wisdom, he began to understand something even more valuable. Character was often invisible until the exact moment the world needed it most. The replacement dinner arrived without ceremony, and this time Ethan Caldwell accepted the plate with quiet confidence. The steak was prepared exactly as the restaurant intended, every detail reflecting the standard that had earned Blackstone House its reputation. Around the table, the conversation resumed as though nothing unusual had happened. Investors discussed expansion into European markets. Attorneys reviewed the final pages of the partnership agreement. Crystal glasses caught the golden light as servers moved gracefully between tables. No one outside the kitchen realized that the evening had nearly taken a very different course. Ethan listened to the discussion for several minutes before gently closing the leather portfolio that contained the unsigned contracts. Every voice at the table gradually faded into silence. His chief financial officer looked up in surprise. "Is something wrong?" Ethan slowly stood from his chair and looked across the dining room until his eyes found Naomi Brooks, collecting empty dessert plates near the back of the room. "Excuse me," he said calmly. The room became unusually quiet as dozens of conversations paused. Naomi turned, clearly assuming another guest needed assistance. Instead, she found the billionaire walking toward her. Daniel Mercer stepped aside, sensing the moment belonged to someone else. Ethan stopped a respectful distance away and spoke in a voice that carried through the elegant dining room without becoming loud. "Miss Brooks, I have spent most of my career believing that leadership meant always having the right answers." He smiled gently before continuing. "Tonight you reminded me that real leadership also means knowing when to listen." Naomi lowered her eyes, visibly uncomfortable becoming the center of attention. "I was only trying to help." Ethan nodded. "Exactly. You helped without asking for recognition. You protected my dinner, this restaurant, and the reputation of everyone working inside it. You solved a problem quietly because preserving dignity mattered more to you than receiving credit." Several guests who had quietly observed the exchange began looking toward Naomi with new respect. Daniel folded his hands in front of him and smiled proudly, saying nothing. Ethan reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and carefully unfolded the handwritten note that had changed the course of the evening. The paper remained perfectly smooth except for the gentle crease where it had been folded. "I think this may be the most valuable document I received tonight," he said with a quiet laugh. A few guests smiled, but no one interrupted. Ethan continued, "Tomorrow morning my company will still sign contracts worth billions of dollars. Those agreements will shape markets. This piece of paper shaped a person." Naomi looked genuinely surprised. "I did not expect that." Ethan answered honestly. "Neither did I." After a thoughtful pause, he reached into his wallet and removed a simple business card instead of a check or a stack of cash. He placed it beside the folded note in Naomi's hand. "If you ever decide you want to finish your education or build a career in quality assurance, call me. Not because I am doing you a favor, but because any organization that ignores someone with your judgment is making an expensive mistake." Naomi looked at the card for only a moment before carefully slipping it into her apron pocket. She smiled with the same quiet grace she had carried all evening. "Thank you, Mr. Caldwell. I will earn that opportunity if I ever call." Ethan smiled in return because he believed every word she had just spoken. The dinner concluded exactly as the financial newspapers would report it the next morning. The partnership was signed. Hands were shaken. Cameras captured polished smiles beneath sparkling chandeliers. Analysts would spend weeks discussing market value, projected growth, and the billions of dollars expected to change hands because of the agreement reached inside Blackstone House. None of those headlines would mention the folded piece of paper resting safely inside Ethan Caldwell's jacket pocket as he walked toward the restaurant's front entrance. To everyone else, it was an ordinary receipt-sized note written in simple blue ink. To Ethan, it had become a reminder that the smallest voice in a room sometimes carries the greatest responsibility. Before leaving, he stopped one last time near the hostess stand where Naomi Brooks was preparing menus for the following day's lunch service. Her shift was nearly over, yet she worked with the same careful attention she had shown since the first guest arrived that evening. Nothing about her posture suggested she believed she had accomplished anything extraordinary. She straightened silverware, aligned reservation cards, and thanked another server for helping clear a table. Ethan smiled quietly. "You are already thinking about tomorrow." Naomi returned the smile. "Someone has to." Ethan nodded. Most people spend their lives trying to be noticed. You spent tonight making sure everyone else succeeded. Naomi answered with the same calm honesty that had defined every conversation between them. My grandmother used to tell me that if people leave happier than when they arrived, then everyone has done their job well. Ethan looked around the elegant dining room one final time. Guests were laughing. Staff members were cleaning tables. The kitchen had returned to its steady rhythm. No one seemed burdened by what had happened because one thoughtful decision had prevented embarrassment before it ever reached the dining room. She taught you more than food science, Ethan said softly. Naomi looked toward the empty table where his untouched first dinner had once rested. She taught me that skill earns respect, but character decides what you do with that skill. Ethan knew he would remember those words far longer than any speech delivered inside a boardroom. Outside, the cool Chicago night welcomed departing guests as city lights reflected across the river like scattered stars. Ethan stepped into the waiting car, but did not immediately ask the driver to leave. Instead, he unfolded the handwritten note once more and read the same two quiet sentences that had interrupted an evening built around certainty. They looked no different than before, yet they meant something entirely new. In business, he had learned to measure value by numbers, contracts, and quarterly reports. Tonight, value had arrived without a title, without an office, and without anyone asking for applause. Weeks later, Blackstone House quietly introduced a new quality review process based on observation techniques that Daniel Mercer credited to lessons learned that evening. Naomi returned to work after finally enrolling in evening classes to complete her degree, determined to earn every opportunity through the same discipline that had guided her all along. Ethan kept his promise as well, not by handing her success, but by opening a door she was fully capable of walking through on her own. Because power may command attention, wealth may fill a room, and influence may shape industries, but none of them can replace the quiet courage to notice what others ignore or the humility to act without seeking recognition. On that ordinary evening inside an extraordinary restaurant, the most important lesson was never served on a plate. It arrived folded into a simple piece of paper, proving that true greatness rarely announces itself. It simply does the right thing when no one is expecting it.